I had a question about the United Nations. Everyone is aware that the idea of the UN as an organization was put forward by the coalition countries to maintain peace and calm and stability in Russia or Soviet Union at the time and the world. They decided to set up an organization that would tackle issues of international law and others. However, over the last 2 or 3 decades, there have been lots of cases proving that UN is dysfunctional. The so-called humanitarian interventions by the United States, for instance, the bombardment of Iraq, the war in Yugoslavia, brought on a lot of human casualties. However, the Mali intervention has been a success story. But nevertheless, do you think there is a need for a speedy reform of the United Nations organization with a new multipolar world arising? And do you think Russia should make the first steps in this direction?
You've raised a fundamental issue of global development and current status of international law. True, the UN was born out of World War II and reflected the then status quo. Of course, the status quo is now changed and the trends continue. The world is going through high-paced developments. Now, as to your question about the efficiency of the United Nations, well, when it was set up, the Cold War started, and Mr. Gromyko, Russia's foreign minister, was called Mr. Niet, Mr. No, because he always used to flatly refuse something. The US had its own, the Soviet Union has its own interests and its own views. And it's not true that the Soviet Union was always guided by its ideological interests. Very often the Soviet Union was guided by geopolitical interests of the nation. Currently, there's no ideological issues between us, but the fighting, the battle between us is still fierce. So geopolitics has always been behind these developments. So the UN has not always been efficient. You mentioned Yugoslavia, you mentioned Iraq. We were against the use of force in Iraq, just like France and Germany. It's unique that France and Germany were together with us against the US. You know, it speaks volumes. And when today the leaders of Europe are far from being independent, but it doesn't mean that this trend is non-existent. There is still such a trend for pursuing your own interests, for independence. If you look at European nations, if you look at the people, not all in the West seem to be noticing this. But the decisions that are taken outside the UN are always doomed to failure, as a rule. You mentioned Iraq. Take Libya. So in the Soviet Union, there was a saying, whatever we start building, we have Avtomashnikov rifle. And it seems to be the same with the US. So whatever they start doing, all they end up with is Libya or Iraq. So when you start to do things in a unilateral way, it seems to have a short history. It's really fragile. Of course, it's hard to get consensus at the UN because you have conflicting views, but that's the only way to forge a lasting solution. If this decision is balanced, if it's supported by all of the international stakeholders, then everyone starts to implement it in the best possible way, and then you get stability. So is the UN efficient today? Not always. You've just repeated a stereotype which our Western partners have always brought up as a trump card during the crisis in Iraq. And everyone used to say the UN doesn't work, you need to find another, to use other organizations like NATO. So unilateral decisions are usually ineffective. But I disagree with the stereotype that you mentioned. You just need to leverage the UN in the right way. You just have to respect each other's opinions.
I had a question about the United Nations. Everyone is aware that the idea of the UN as an organization was put forward by the coalition countries to maintain peace and calm and stability in Russia or Soviet Union at the time and the world. They decided to set up an organization that would tackle issues of international law and others. However, over the last 2 or 3 decades, there have been lots of cases proving that UN is dysfunctional. The so-called humanitarian interventions by the United States, for instance, the bombardment of Iraq, the war in Yugoslavia, brought on a lot of human casualties. However, the Mali intervention has been a success story. But nevertheless, do you think there is a need for a speedy reform of the United Nations organization with a new multipolar world arising? And do you think Russia should make the first steps in this direction?